From the University of Notre Dame, I'm Andy Fuller. Welcome to Notre Dame Stories. Well, it's a story you might see on the news from time to time, but never quite understand the underlying issues at play. I'm talking about human trafficking. We spoke to a professor who is hoping to shine light on this topic to effect change. Here with Dean Shepard, the Ray and Milann Siegfried Professor of Entrepreneurship in the Mendoza College of Business. Dean, thanks for joining us.
No worries.
So we're talking about your recent study on human trafficking, and as I was reading about it, it strikes me that human trafficking is one of those areas that is sort of intuitively understood. By that I mean, I think a lot of people know that it's happening, but very few of us know exactly how or why. So tell me the story of how you came to this subject matter and how it kind of fits into your broader area of research.
Yeah. So, this study actually started out by not looking for human trafficking, but just finding it. So, I'm an entrepreneurship scholar, and I've been looking at how entrepreneurship can help people in highly adverse environments deal with their lives and kind of earn some income, but also kind of improve the quality of their life. And what we did is, we've looked at a number of different contexts, but one of the contexts we started to look at was in the sex industry. And we wanted to try and understand why women would choose to enter the sex industry. Obviously, desperation from adversity in order to try and earn some income and have their families survive. But what we did is we started asking these women, why they chose to enter the industry. Almost none of them chose it. They were either tricked or sold to human traffickers. And so what we did is, once we started learning that, we very quickly changed the research topic to explore how they were tricked and how they were trafficked and how that all came about.
Mm-hmm. Is there a reason you looked at India for this study? And are there dynamics that maybe can be applied more broadly?
Right. Yeah. So, one way I do my research is to try and come up with some interesting topics, is to think about me search, so things that really resonate with me, or we search. And so one of the members of our research team, Vinit Parida, is in Sweden, but he's Indian. And so when we first got together starting doing research, we said, well, what's unique about our pairing? And, I said, well, I can bring some entrepreneurship, and then you can bring in, these very resource-constrained environments in India. I suppose what's interesting for me is entrepreneurship research is primarily focused on kind of more resource-rich or resource-abundant environments. And basically, nearly everything we know is about how we have substantial resources, or we can access resources, or we have slack resources. So most of the research is about that. But I think most entrepreneurship that happens in the world is actually the opposite, where it's very resource constrained, very resource poor, and people are highly resourceful, and where necessity is the mother of innovation rather than resource slack. So, we're kind of heading off in an area where research hasn't done much. But interestingly, I think that's where most of the actually entrepreneurship stuff actually gets done. So that's the main reason, it was a combination of Vinit and I and another guy, Joachim Vincent, who started working in this area, and that's how we came up with the different topics.
Gotcha. So in a resource-constrained environment like India, that dynamic, you can think of any number of places in the world where that is the case, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Gotcha. You mentioned one particular woman in the study. I'm going to pronounce her name, Shrita. What is it about her story that sort of exemplifies the broader issues that you found in the course of the study?
Yeah, it's, I first want to say that it's a fake name, so we kept everybody anonymous. I think we just used that quote in the article in the newspaper brief that was created. But in the actual research article, we have a whole lot of women that we quote directly. So she's not the only one. But yeah, I mean, as I said from the very introduction, when we started expecting a certain answer and we weren't getting it, we were getting a different answer. It was actually quite surprising how consistent all the women were in their explanations. How they were tricked, how they were entrapped, how they were trafficked. So I don't think there was anything unique about her. It was just all the women had actually very consistent stories.
So how does that happen then? You've mentioned now a couple of times that women are tricked. How does that happen? Is it a family member? Is it someone they just kind of meet and offers them a job? How does that work?
So there were two basic aspects, but it was kind of like a bait and switch where, for example, a family member, often like an auntie or an uncle, would say to them, look, I've got a job for you in the city as a housemaid. Come with me and I'll get you that job. And what that auntie does was actually sell the girl, typically a girl, but sometimes a woman, to somebody, this trafficker, and then they move on. So that was one of the ways. The other way is, a boy would pretend to fall in love with the girl, say, run away with me. They run away and he actually sells her on. One of the disturbing aspects is that the family kind of had plausible deniability, but it's really not that plausible. That I think the family know. They may not give a wink and a nod to it, but they kind of know. And the sad thing is that in some ways the family are responsible for the girl leaving, and in some ways they almost sacrifice one child in order to kind of support the others. But one of the things that entraps the women so that they can't leave the industry is that they believe, and probably rightly so, they cannot go back to the village because they're now stigmatized that they work in the sex industry. And a stigmatization that resulted from the family's negligence from protecting these girls in the first place. So that in itself is a bit of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, you mentioned being disturbed as you're hearing these stories and doing this research, and that's obviously the case. Was there anything about this that was particularly shocking to you as you were doing this research? Yeah. I mean, it's all pretty shocking for a guy who lives in America who's an Australian, right,
and a male. But the biggest shocking thing for me was that these women, after being tricked, drugged, raped, and then forced into the sex industry, eventually they start to get given more autonomy, but then they have no choices of where to go. And eventually these women, as they get older, become recruiters themselves. And so the most disturbing thing is that it becomes a vicious cycle that these women are tricked, entrapped, and all their autonomy is taken away. They're forced into this industry. But then those women or those girls, as they grow up to be women, actually start recruiting new women and they become the traffickers. So it's like the victim starts to engage in victimizing others. And that part in particular is disturbing.
Do you have any insight into why that is? Is it just because in a way it's kind of all they know and they're perpetuating it? Yeah.
So in some ways I think, it's almost like they get brainwashed. So they're actually kind of get reprogrammed. So they say, well, you used to think you have agency, you don't have any ability to make any decisions about your life. And then eventually they start to be given some autonomy, but only within the industry in which they're involved. And then, if they could escape, where would they escape to? They can't escape back to the village. They can't get other jobs. So there are some NGOs, non-government organisations now that are trying to help these women escape and kind of start a new life, but they really don't have many. And then it's also a little bit like, we went through all this and we survived. Why can't you? So yeah, I mean, it's something happens in the change of their brain, really, and the way that they think, that kind of allows them to survive, and that also allows them to then go and try and attract these other people into the industry.
When it comes to addressing it, I'm just thinking broadly here. There's probably two areas. One, caring for the victims who somehow make it out, but then also addressing sort of the larger structural, cultural issues that can play a role in prevention. Your study mentioned an NGO-based intervention that seemed to be successful. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so we spoke with these guys. I think they were priests, one from Australia and one from New Zealand, believe it or not, and that they created an organisation in the red light area where they would help women who were either discarded from the sex industry. Because I kept asking them, well, okay, what do they do when they get old enough? And there was no real answer. And I think the answer is, they just don't survive, unfortunately. So in this NGO, the women were actually engaged in some form of tapestry work and making clothes. And then the NGO would sell the clothes to fund the continued operation of that particular business. So the women actually lived there, ate there. And so they worked and they were able to kind of survive after that. I think about this myself. I kind of do my research more at the individual level and, maybe groups. And I think this requires some substantial institutional change. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have very good answers for it other than to say, I don't think we can change an industry unless we understand it. So hopefully this research, while it can't tell us how to change it, at least we're starting to understand it. Right? Mm-hmm. And so, if I had to guess, I think it has to do with if we can remove poverty, which is itself such a huge thing, but if the villages can have less poverty, then they're going to be less likely to sacrifice women. Education would have to be a big part of that. So if we educate people that here are the tricks that people engage in order to trick people into this industry, then that would be one thing. Another thing might be if we can try and create these social norms where we don't stigmatize women who are tricked into this industry, but realize, one, that they were tricked into it and that they're a victim and we shouldn't stigmatize victims. That'll allow people to escape and maybe go back to their villages and go back to their families. But yeah, I mean, these are big structural things. And unfortunately, I can see how people can find a way out maybe, but it's hard to think about how to kind of structurally change all of these aspects.
Right. And even if you can, it's certainly not something that can be done overnight. You're talking about societal change, which is a large ship to turn.
Absolutely.
What do you hope, and maybe you've already answered this in part, but what do you hope is the main outcome of this work?
Yeah, I mean, it's hopefully what we were just talking about, that we can understand this process a little bit better. And so perhaps other researchers will also start researching it, perhaps people who have a public policy perspective, or sociologists or educationalists, or even politicians in developing countries, and kind of engages in kind of education. So hopefully someone gets in there and can use what we've done as a small step towards a deeper understanding of where we can change the kind of structural issues that lead to this. And so in this way, we can kind of move towards helping at least some of the people, either avoiding getting into it or helping people get out of it.
Dean Shepherd, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Notre Dame Stories. In our next episode, we'll take you back across the pond for a look at how Notre Dame students are experiencing London. Notre Dame Stories is produced by the Office of Public Affairs and Communications. I'm your host, Andy Fuller. Our music is by Alex Mansour.